In case you fail to realize, the things you hunt, they're not beasts. They're people.
Hark, dear hunter, and welcome. You stand at the precipice of another sojourn through the warped avenues and forsaken chronicles that comprise gaming's bleakest legends. This evening, our tale is one of redemption perverted into perdition, of phenomenal remedies that festered into abominable plagues. We speak of the old blood, the medium that raised Yharnam from an overlooked township into a bastion of medicinal marvels, and consequently plunged it into a bad dream, from which escape is a rarity. Tonight, our path follows its course, from the primeval labyrinth deep below the city to the climactic instances when the gutters flowed with a tide far thicker than mere blood. Long before the inaugural taste of old blood passed human lips, Yharnam existed as an ordinary city, cradled in a valley and flanked by thick woodlands and towering peaks. Its people led unassuming lives as artisans, merchants, and tillers of the soil. The Gothic constructions that would in time become emblems of horror and dread were at their inception merely the stylistic choices of practical craftsmen using the local stone. The city's very bedrock was founded upon something far more ancient than its contemporary dwellers could fathom. Deep below the cobblestones and crypts lay a sprawling network of catacombs and ruins from an era preceding human recollection. The Thumerians, a name later bestowed by academics, had carved these labyrinths for reasons that remained a mystery. The majority of early Yharnam's populace remained ignorant of what rested beneath their feet. They moved through their daily routines, oblivious that they trod upon the sepulchres of a civilization that had unearthed cosmic truths best left interred. In those nascent times, Yharnam was a magnet for scholars and archaeologists, lured by whispers of antique ruins. Bergenworth College, located in the city's vicinity, emerged as a nexus of scholarship and archaeological inquiry. Master Willem, the provost of Bergenworth, congregated the most brilliant intellects of his age to delve into history, archaeology, and the essence of human consciousness. Among his students were the figures who would later define and destroy Yharnam, though at the time they were simply young scholars hungry for answers. The ambitious Laurence displayed a fascination with the archaeological ventures. Gehrman, who valued practical application over abstract theory, frequently joined these expeditions to guard against the perils of uncharted ruins. Micolash, already considered peculiar, devoted his nights to scrutinizing ancient scripts and sigils that his peers wrote off as gibberish. Maria, of the noble Cainhurst lineage, contributed both her martial skill and a keen mind to their circle. These names would resonate throughout the Yharnam saga, though none could foresee the parts they were destined to play in the city's metamorphosis. The discovery that altered the course of everything was not the result of meticulous archaeological effort, but of sheer chance. A building project within the city inadvertently broke through into a primeval vault. The workers spoke of strange things near the breach, voices in no living tongue, shadows that moved without casting a source, and dreams so vivid they made waking life feel thin. The scholars from Bergenworth were summoned to examine what the construction crew had exhumed. What they unearthed within that vault would redefine Yharnam and the essence of human comprehension itself. The chamber walls bore carvings of entities with impossible geometries, creatures that existed in the margins of perception. Scattered among them were residues of a substance that defied every attempt at classification. It was neither solid nor fluid, neither animate nor inanimate, and it seemed to pulse with a faint light from within. Those who drew too close came away changed, speaking of visions they could not comprehend, but most importantly, they could not forget. This was humanity's first encounter with what would later be called the Old Blood. The Thumerian labyrinth extended to depths far greater than anyone at Bergenworth had first conceived. Every new foray uncovered additional strata, deeper secrets, and fresh terrors. Its design seemed to mock conventional laws of space. Passageways that logically should have converged never did. Chambers were found in locations that geometry declared impossible. The further the scholars descended, the clearer it became that the Thumerians had engineered a conduit between the human sphere and something immeasurably more vast and terrifying, rather than merely building tombs. Provost Willem was at the forefront of these expeditions, propelled by an unquenchable desire to understand humanity's place in the order of things. He posited that the Thumerians had ascended beyond their mortal shells to make contact with something sublime. The evidence they found lent a disturbing weight to his hypothesis. They unearthed Thumerian skeletons bearing signs of intentional self-alteration. Bones warped into impossible configurations. Craniums with hollows for organs unknown to human anatomy. And most strikingly, an utter lack of decomposition. The deepest reaches of the labyrinth yielded the most remarkable discovery. The Thumerian monarchs themselves. Unlike the remains scattered through the upper tiers, these figures had been preserved with uncanny care. Queen Yharnam lay in a sealed vault, the air around her thick and strangely charged. Ancient as she was, she did not look entirely dead. Her skin had not collapsed into the desiccation one would expect. Her veins, when examined, still carried blood. Slow, almost reluctant in its movement, but moving nonetheless. The academics who studied her could not account for it. The blood behaved in ways blood simply did not. Laurence grew fixated on the blood's unique characteristics. His clandestine experiments soon revealed its astounding capabilities. When applied to human tissue, the blood triggered quick regeneration. Ailments that had tormented humanity for ages simply ceased to exist in its presence. Injuries that would take weeks to mend now healed in mere moments. The possibilities were breathtaking. Before them was a substance that could eradicate human suffering, cure any disease, and perhaps even conquer death itself. Willem, however, preached restraint. His interpretations of the Thumerian scriptures, as much as he could decipher, hinted that the blood exacted a heavy toll. The Thumerians had been warped by their communion with entities that existed beyond all reckoning, rising to no higher station than that of cautionary example. The Great Ones, as the writings referred to them, were deities in no human sense. Their existence only partially brushed against human reality, and their effect on the human mind and body was erratic at best, and at worst, ruinous beyond repair. The rift between Willem and Laurence formed around this core conflict. Willem was convinced that humanity first needed to evolve its mind and spirit before it could safely wield the power of the Great Ones. He was a proponent of cultivating insight, the broadening of the human mind, to perceive and grasp these realities without being annihilated by them. Fear the old blood, he would often say to his pupils, a phrase that would prove to be a dark prophecy. Laurence interpreted Willem's prudence as timidity. The blood presented immediate, concrete advantages. People were in agony, succumbing to treatable sicknesses, while academics debated philosophical points. He contended that humanity could reap the blood's rewards, while simultaneously researching its nature, mastering its power without falling prey to its perils. His magnetic personality and the promise of the blood's restorative powers drew a large following, including some of Willem's most gifted disciples. This schism between Willem and Laurence signaled the close of Bergenworth's illustrious era and the dawn of something both new and dreadful. Laurence departed from the college, carrying with him a few vials of the old blood and a grand design for the future of mankind. In Yharnam, he founded the Healing Church, initially framing it as a medical institution committed to employing the old blood's qualities to mend the sick and the afflicted, with no religious pretensions at all. The nascent period of the Healing Church appeared to confirm Laurence's aspirations. The practice of blood ministration, as it was named, performed miracles that surpassed even Laurence's most optimistic forecasts. The sightless regained their vision. The crippled walked anew. And illnesses that were once a death warrant became trivial ailments. News of these feats spread rapidly beyond Yharnam's confines. Pilgrims began to stream in, first by the hundreds, and then by the thousands, all in pursuit of the miraculous remedy offered by the Healing Church. Yharnam's change was breathtakingly swift. The flood of pilgrims endowed the once humble city with riches and renown. Imposing cathedrals were erected where modest chapels once stood. The Healing Church initiated spectacular architectural endeavors that clawed at the heavens, as if striving to span the chasm between earth and whatever lay beyond it. The grand cathedral emerged as the heart of the city's new persona, its chimes summoning the devout to partake in their communion of blood. Gehrman, Laurence's old associate from their Bergenworth days, founded the workshop in the church's undercroft, first envisioned as a space for creating tools to further explore the Thumerian ruins. It soon became something more focused. Gehrman had seen things in the labyrinth that persuaded him that the old blood's boons were accompanied by threats necessitating preparation. He started to forge weapons, not for human conflict, but for the hunting of creatures that were once men. The blood saints, young women who showed a special affinity for the old blood, rose to a central role in the church's functions. Their own blood, after being infused with the old blood, could cure others, obviating the need for direct ingestion of the original substance. Adela, among the most fervent blood saints, regarded her function as a sacred obligation. She and her peers literally gave their blood for the salvation of Yharnam's citizens and pilgrims. Their veins repeatedly tapped to supply the healing fluid for the populace. The church established a multifaceted structure to oversee the blood's distribution and research. The choir, composed of Bergenworth academics who had sided with Laurence, pressed on with inquiries into the deeper implications of the old blood. They founded the orphanage, though its actual aim was less about sheltering parentless children and more about experimenting on young intellects that might more readily acclimate to truths no adult mind could absorb. The school of Mensis, under Mikolash's direction, delved into even more arcane studies, endeavoring to use the old blood to establish a direct link with the Great Ones. We will speak of each one of them at length tonight. Yet even in these initial, hopeful times, ominous signs started to surface. Some individuals who underwent blood ministration described troubling dreams. They recounted visions of vast cities with impossible designs, of entities observing them from the voids between stars, and of a summons that drew them toward an entity they could neither name nor understand. The church explained these away as transient side effects, the mind merely acclimating to the blood's curative effects. They set up secluded wards for those whose dreams grew overly vivid, ensuring their comfort while simultaneously studying their conditions. The first manifestation of a beast occurred 3 years after the church was established. A pilgrim who had undergone blood ministration months prior suddenly transformed during the night, his form contorting and expanding into a lupine horror. This entity claimed 12 lives before Gehrman himself dispatched it with a blade crafted for such hunts. The church concealed the event, attributing it to a wild beast that had somehow infiltrated the city. Gehrman, however, knew the truth perceived the intelligence glittering in the creature's eyes, the lingering fragments of a human soul ensnared within a bestial shell. The plague of beasts started insidiously sporadic events that the church could manage and rationalize. A vanished person in one instance, a supposed animal mauling in another, always confined to the more impoverished areas where inquiries were seldom made. The church's hunters, honed by Gehrman in the workshop, handled these initial beasts with quiet efficiency. The people of Yharnam carried on with their existence, continued their blood ministrations, and maintained their faith in the healing church's miracle. However, the rate of these changes escalated. What were once monthly occurrences became weekly and then nightly events. The church could no longer suppress the reality. A portion of those who imbibed the old blood were metamorphosing into beasts. They invented the term Scourge of Beasts to label the plague, framing it as an external menace rather than a direct outcome of blood ministration. The church's official narrative was that these breakings only afflicted individuals with tainted blood or faltering faith, thus spurring the populace to demonstrate their loyalty through even greater zeal in their blood ministration rituals. The collective mindset of Yharnam began to warp. The city that had once embraced pilgrims now regarded all outsiders with distrust. If impure blood was the cause of the beast plague, it stood to reason that foreigners posed the highest risk. The church made no effort to quell this rising xenophobia, as it furnished a ready scapegoat for the escalating beast sightings. Vigilante groups materialized, pursuing suspected beasts, or sometimes just those who appeared out of place. The fact that Yharnam's wealth was built on the influx of foreign pilgrims was a forgotten irony. Amid the mounting panic, Gehrman's hunters grew from a select coterie of expert warriors into a body vital for the city's endurance. The first hunter, as Gehrman was now known, laid down the customs and methods that would shape the hunt for ages to come. The hunter's dream, a strange plane that Gehrman entered through a method he never disclosed, served as a haven and proving ground for new hunters. There, detached from the conventional passage of time, hunters could sharpen their abilities and steel themselves for the nightmarish truth of their vocation. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower rose to become Gehrman's most exceptional student. Her mastery of the rakuyo, a sword that could be split into two separate weapons, was rivaled only by her escalating revulsion for the hunt's demands. The beasts they were forced to kill had once been people, patients who had journeyed to Yharnam in search of a cure. Every hunt compelled her to face the dreadful reality the church persistently refuted. The old blood was no remedy, but a malediction, one that remade its recipients into monsters. The research hall, created by the church to investigate the beast plague and devise new therapies, became a gallery of horrors. Patients brought in with initial signs of the turning never seen again. The experiments performed within transgressed the limits of medical ethics, venturing into the domain of pure sadism. The researchers, frantic to grasp the mechanics of the corruption, put patients through procedures that under any situation would be deemed torture. They rationalized their conduct by asserting that understanding the beast plague would ultimately preserve more lives than they were sacrificing. One of the darkest findings arose from observing the corruption itself. The shift from human to beast was not arbitrary or instantaneous. It adhered to patterns linked to the person's psychological state. Emotions like fear, rage, and hopelessness quickened the change. Those who yielded to their most primal urges, who reveled in violence and slaughter, transformed with greater speed and finality. The hunt itself, that grim practice of slaying beasts, inexorably nudged the hunters closer to becoming the creatures they pursued. The church devised fresh approaches to handle the plague. The powder kegs, a hunter faction that preferred explosives and firearms to conventional melee, pushed for more drastic measures. They proposed incinerating entire city districts if it meant halting the plague's advance. The church knights, warriors blending martial skill with religious zeal, patrolled the city, enforcing curfews and culling suspected beasts. The city increasingly took on the semblance of a totalitarian state, with the church's power being absolute and beyond challenge. The healing church formally established the hunt, elevating it from a crisis protocol to a recurring ceremony. They designated specific nights as official hunts, periods when the populace was to secure their homes and allow the hunters to do what needed to be done. The symphony of the hunt became a fixture of Yharnam's nights. The howls of beasts, the clang of steel, the screams of the dying, and pervading all, the great chimes of the cathedral, tolling the hours until the break of day. On such nights, Yharnam became an entirely different metropolis. Its streets were deserted, save for hunters and their quarry. Incense smoldered in large braziers, its fumes purportedly warding off beasts, though it more likely served to obscure the stench of blood and decay. Windows were shuttered, doors were bolted, and families huddled in their homes, praying the sounds of conflict would bypass their dwellings. On the morning following a hunt, residents would step out to find their city awash in blood, with piles of beast carcasses awaiting incineration, and sometimes, chillingly, a familiar face among the deceased. The hunters cultivated their own distinct subculture, detached from the mainstream of Yharnam society. They congregated in designated spots. The hunter's dream for the privileged few who could enter it, and various workshops and safe havens for the rest. They exchanged strategies, armaments, and most critically, ways to preserve their own humanity. The ingestion of blood became a cornerstone of their practice. Hunters relied on blood vials to mend their injuries, thereby becoming dependent on the same substance that fueled the plague they were fighting. This irony was not overlooked by the more introspective among them. Father Gascoigne serves as a tragic archetype for the fate of many hunters. A clergyman from a foreign land who settled in Yharnam with his family. He embraced the hunt to shield his wife and daughters. His proficiency with the hunter's axe grew to be legendary, and his confrontations with beasts became progressively more savage. Yet each hunt altered him, amplifying his aggression and his thirst for the kill. His spouse, Viola, observed her husband's slow descent into bloodlust, as he became more beast than human, long before any physical change occurred. The music box cherished by Gascoigne's daughter played a tune from his native land, one of the rare things that could pacify him when his bloodlust surged. But even this tie to his former self frayed over time. The evening he did not come back. The evening his family's music box failed to reach him signified the perfect image of the hunt's inevitable conclusion. Those who pursue beasts for too long are destined to become them, if not in flesh, then undeniably in mind. The church explored a variety of techniques to keep hunters from transforming. The hunter rune, derived from a prototype crafted by the runesmith Karel after a communion with the Great Ones, was said to guard against the beast plague. Special attire treated with unique incense and blood ministration methods claimed to anchor a hunter's humanity. These, however, were mere poultices on a fatal wound. The core paradox persisted. Hunters required blood for the hunt, yet blood was their corruption's own instrument. All were bound by the same ultimate destiny, the curse of the bloodlust. As Yharnam grappled with the spreading beast plague, a separate tragedy was playing out at the remote castle Cainhurst. This noble family, secluded in a frigid, desolate landscape, and reachable only via a perilous bridge, possessed its own unique connection to the old blood. The Cainhurst aristocracy had not obtained their blood through the healing church. Instead, a rogue Bergenworth scholar had carried forbidden blood to Cainhurst, blood that even Laurence's circle considered too dangerous to touch. And from that act, the Vilebloods line began. The nobles of Cainhurst fostered a different kind of relationship with the blood. They did not use it for its healing properties, but imbibed it to gain power. They found that specific types of blood, especially that of hunters who had themselves taken in large quantities of old blood, bestowed upon them otherworldly powers. They gained the ability to wield blood as a weapon, to siphon the life essence from their foes, and most unnervingly, to cheat death itself. The Vilebloods did not see themselves as cursed, but as an evolved form of humanity, the subsequent stage in our development. Their culture reflected this self-regard. The Cainhurst way was one of nostalgia and bombast in equal measure. They took pride in their work to a degree that unsettled outsiders. The corpses of beasts they left behind were not considered refuse, but were regarded as examples of decadent art, proof of their refinement, even in slaughter. The castle itself was filled with portraits and sculptures venerating the nobles who had come before, a practice not unlike the death masks of ancient Roman aristocracy, where bloodline was not merely heritage, but the foundation of one's claim to power and purpose. In Cainhurst, that claim ran deeper still, because the blood was not metaphor, it was everything. This formality extended to the queen herself. Annalise did not receive visitors. She received supplicants. Those who entered her chamber without kneeling were met with cold rebuke. Those who showed proper deference were taught the gestures of respect she expected as a matter of course. She was not performing ceremony. She inhabited it completely, as though the rituals of the court were the only thing still anchoring her to something recognizably human. Queen Annalise, the undying monarch of Cainhurst, governed from her throne with an air of both aristocratic grace and an inhuman craving. She coveted blood dregs, the most potent residues of human blood that held echoes of the old blood's might. Her knights would harvest these dregs from slain hunters and present them to their queen as tribute. But this was not mere appetite. The purpose behind it was far older and stranger than the healing church would ever acknowledge. Annalise sought to one day bear a child of blood, to undergo the same ancient process that Queen Yharnam of the Thumerians had undergone long before her. The Vilebloods were not simply drinking blood out of hunger or malice. They were completing a ritual that stretched back to the age of the Great Ones themselves, when wedlock was a blood contract, and certain chosen people were marked to bear a Great One's child. It was this truth that the church buried under simpler language. Alfred, a loyal executioner, described the Vilebloods as vile fiends, enemies of the church, nothing more. It was a characterization designed to foreclose questions rather than answer them. The Vilebloods were heretics because the blood they carried pointed towards something the church could not control or claim. The executioners, commanded by Martyr Ligarius, embarked on a holy war against Cainhurst, a conflict that would go down as one of Yharnam's most savage. Ligarius was convinced that the Vilebloods embodied a defilement even more heinous than the beast plague. While beasts were unfortunate souls who had lost their humanity, the Vilebloods had willfully cast theirs aside. The storming of Castle Cainhurst was less a battle and more a brutal slaughter. The executioners offered no quarter, felling nobles, retainers, and anyone who had partaken in the Vileblood ritual. The ghosts that still drifted through the castle's halls in the years that followed seemed to carry the memory of it, hollow figures with their throats slashed, weeping without sound. The siege concluded in a deadlock. Ligarius, finding himself unable to slay the immortal Queen Annalise, opted to become her warden instead. He destroyed the bridge, confined her within her chambers, and mounted an unending vigil from the castle's highest point, channeling his own life force into the seal that held her captive. His crown of illusions cloaked what remained of Cainhurst from the outside world. It was an act of total sacrifice, and perhaps, unlike Alfred, who came after him, Ligarius understood exactly what he was containing and why it could not simply be destroyed. However, even this ultimate act of self-sacrifice was not without its flaws. Resolute individuals could still discover the path to Cainhurst, and a few even pledged their allegiance to the captive queen. Maria, the hunter who had been Gehrman's protege, bore the disgrace of her Cainhurst ancestry throughout her time in Yharnam. She had renounced her noble bloodline, even casting her cherished Rakuyo into a well as a symbolic act of disavowal. But blood, particularly that of nobility, is not so easily forsaken. The skills she had mastered in Cainhurst, her ability to make blood dance and slice, lingered with her even as she sought to adopt the Church's principles. Her inner turmoil, caught between her lineage and her adopted cause, would ultimately propel her into a spiral of madness and sorrow. We will unravel her story as we speak more of the saga of Yharnam and the Old Blood. The choir was engaged in a different quest for understanding, centered on the Old Blood and its wellspring. Comprised of the most brilliant minds within the healing church, the choir conducted its work from the upper echelons of the grand cathedral, placing them both physically and metaphorically above the mundane struggles of beast hunts and blood ministration. Their ambition was to comprehend the ultimate source of the Old Blood, the Great Ones themselves. Their roots, however, stretched back further than the church. The choir owed much of its foundational thinking to Bargainworth, the old college that predated the church entirely. Master Willem, the college's provost, grew disillusioned with the ceiling of human thought, convinced that the mind, as it existed in men and women, was simply too small an instrument. His response was to seek enlargement of a different kind, lining the brain with eyes, accumulating insight until perception itself transformed. The blindfold he wore was a rejection of ordinary sight, a way of turning attention inward toward something larger. The choir adopted this same blindfold as part of their own garb, and it was no coincidence. They saw themselves as the true inheritors of Willem's inquiry, even as they departed sharply from some of his methods. The falling out between Willem and Laurence, already covered earlier, produced the healing church, and eventually, through the church's own internal fractures, the choir itself. The scholars who would become the choir carried both legacies forward: Willem's fixation on elevated mind and Laurence's willingness to use the Old Blood to elevate the body. They drew on blood ministration as an accelerant, while insisting that the true destination was always the mind, always the cosmos. The orphanage became the choir's principal source of new members. Children, the choir theorized, had minds more pliable and capable of absorbing what adults could not without breaking. The experiments performed on these young orphans were framed in the benevolent terms of education and spiritual awakening, but they remained experiments all the same. Impressionable minds were subjected to slivers of great one knowledge, and their responses were meticulously recorded. Some of the children developed extraordinary perceptive abilities, while others were driven to insanity. The choir regarded both results as equally precious data. What made this arrangement especially grim was how neatly it served the church's existing infrastructure. The healing church already moved through Yharnam, collecting the dead and the abandoned. Directing orphaned children into the orphanage required no great effort and attracted no suspicion. From the outside, it appeared charitable. Inside, the children were shaped from their earliest years into scholars devoted entirely to a single line of inquiry. The same inquiry that had begun in the labyrinths under Bergenworth and had never truly been resolved. By the time these children grew into adults, they had known nothing else. Their loyalty was total, and their ambitions matched those of the institution that had raised them. Gradually, this group accrued enough influence and intellectual weight that they became their own faction within the church, not elected to their position, but grown into it, until the choir was effectively running the institution from above. The splitting of the church that followed was not a clean process. The orphanage key makes clear that the choir's emergence divided the church rather than unified it, and it is difficult to imagine that happening peacefully. Those within the church who still clung to a more conventional theological framework, or who were simply unsettled by what was being done in the orphanage, would have found themselves increasingly at odds with a ruling body that saw human lives primarily as research material. The choir did not negotiate with such objections. They had been raised in a place where the work was everything. The celestial emissaries, bloated things with bulbous heads and squirming appendages, were a product of the choir's experimentation. These entities had previously been human, specifically choir members who had submitted to procedures intended to elevate them closer to the Great Ones. The bestial corruption that plagued the rest of Yharnam was a collapse inward, a return to something raw and animal. The choir's procedure aimed in the opposite direction. The resulting creatures were undeniably no longer human, but whether they had attained true enlightenment or simply a new form of damnation was a matter of debate. They were not the choir's first attempt at this kind of transformation. The research hall, which appears to have occupied the same ground on which the orphanage was later built, had already pursued something similar. Patients there had been subjected to procedures that left them bloated and strange, faintly aquatic in appearance, capable in some cases of channeling cosmic energy, but only when standing within the Lumenflower Gardens, and never reliably. The church called them living failures, and the name was accurate. Whatever connection they had managed to forge with the higher plane was unstable, flickering, insufficient. The choir looked at those results and refined them. The celestial emissaries were a second attempt at the same problem, more controlled, more successful, and considerably more disturbing. The lumen flower gardens themselves were part of the methodology. These were not decorative. Lumen flowers, according to the milkweed rune, attract phantasms. Small invertebrate creatures with a deep and poorly understood connection to the Great Ones and the cosmic plane. Phantasms appear wherever insight concentrates. They cluster around beings of elevated thought, serving as both familiars and bridges, linking the lower plane of human existence to whatever lies above it. Growing them in gardens created a kind of reservoir, a place where these connections could be nurtured and directed. The choir placed the celestial emissaries among them deliberately, using the phantasms to amplify whatever contact the emissaries were capable of making. Ebrietta's, daughter of the cosmos, was perhaps the clearest proof of how far the choir had pushed their research. Discovered deep within the Thumerian labyrinth, this great one seemed to have been forsaken or left behind by its kin. The choir transported her to the grand cathedral, concealing her in its most sacred depths. Through their communion with this alien presence, the choir acquired knowledge that rewrote their understanding of the old blood. The connection began with an object called the Augur of Ebrietta's, a remnant found by Bergenworth scholars that allowed a fragment of her presence to be summoned even across different planes of reality. It was this object, as much as anything else, that set the choir's inquiry in motion and eventually led them back into the labyrinths to find her in full. The discovery of the great Is chalice was what made direct contact possible. It became, in the choir's own accounting, a cornerstone of everything they subsequently built. Once they broke the seal and explored the Is labyrinth, they encountered Ebrietta's at its deepest level and brought her back to the upper cathedral ward. From that point, the choir had something no other faction in Yharnam possessed, a living great one working alongside them. The choir garb describes this arrangement plainly, noting that together with the left behind Great One, they looked to the skies in search of astral signs. Ebrietta's was not a prisoner in Upper Cathedral Ward, but she was also not free. Both parties were, in different ways, searching for the same thing. The connection between the choir and Ebrietta's was one of mutual benefit, yet deeply unequal. The Great One furnished them with knowledge and blood, and in return received something the choir could not fully grasp. Some academics speculated that Ebrietta's was using them to search for something, perhaps other great ones who had abandoned her. Others believed she was slowly reshaping her collaborators into something that could bridge the gap between human and Great One awareness, cultivating a hybrid form of life to serve purposes no human mind could yet conceive. What the choir understood and articulated with more precision than any other group in Yharnam was the structure of reality itself. Their note in Upper Cathedral Ward reads simply, "The sky and the cosmos are one." Reality, in their understanding, was not a single plane, but a stack of them, each sitting above the other like layers pressed together. Creatures fall from one level into another, crossing what appears to be open sky, but is in fact the floor of the plane above. The cosmos then was not somewhere impossibly distant. It sat immediately above the human world, pressing against the ceiling of ordinary perception. When one looked up at the sky, one was looking at the base of a higher plane of existence. All the research into insight, into phantasms, into celestial emissaries and lumen flower gardens was aimed at crossing that threshold. The Eye Watcher badge, worn by all members of the choir, reflected this creed directly. They believed true enlightenment was found by gazing upward, with earthly matters left below. They refined methods for acquiring insight, the faculty to perceive reality as it truly was rather than through the constrained filter of human senses. This insight, however, came with a dreadful toll. Those who accumulated too much could see the amygdalas that had always clung to Yharnam's edifices, the writhing messengers drifting through the air, and the way reality buckled in the presence of the Great Ones. Many who reached a high level of insight found the weight of such perception unendurable. Among those who broke under it were some of the choir's own members. The brain-suckers found throughout the orphanage, and in notable numbers at Bergenworth and within the labyrinths, were likely scholars overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. When one is exposed to enough eldritch knowledge, the phantasms drawn to that accumulation of insight can effectively take root in the mind, displacing the self and turning the body into a vehicle for their own hunger. The result is a creature that seeks insight the way a starving thing seeks food, dragging it out of others to feed a need it cannot articulate. They still carry traces of cosmic power, evidence of the contact they once almost achieved. But the mind that had been reaching toward the Great Ones is gone. Alongside Ebrietta's herself, the clearest sign that the choir's methods had genuine foundation was a woman who has come to be known simply as the Imposter, a rogue choir member who took over Yesofka's clinic during the chaos of the night of the hunt. She used the clinic as a private research station, converting every survivor sent there into a celestial emissary in pursuit of her own ascension. Her dialogues reveal a person entirely consumed by the work, someone who had excised ordinary feeling from herself so thoroughly that the arrival of a new test subject registered as professional opportunity. She speaks of a procedure, of progress, of being chosen. She uses a call beyond and the augur of Ebrietta's, the signature tools of the choir, and her notes mention the eventual use of old blood in the transformation process. By the time the blood moon rises over Yharnam, she has been rewarded with a third umbilical cord. In her final dialogue, she describes something writhing inside her head, something she experiences as rapture rather than violation. She had done what the choir had always sought to do. She was ascending. The giant celestial emissary in the orphanage's lumen flower garden tells a similar story. The achievement awarded for defeating. It describes the creature as a great one, meaning that at some point through the choir's methods and the influence of the lumen flowers and whatever communion it had managed to sustain with the higher plane, This being crossed the threshold, it became what the choir had always been reaching for. The tragedy is that this happened inside a building that had by then already collapsed into carnage, with no one left to observe or record it. And the celestial children scattered across the grounds outside the orphanage round out a picture that is deeply disturbing in its logic. The only one of these creatures, whose origins a hunter can directly witness, is born from Ariana during the blood moon, the product of a great one's blessing upon a mortal womb. The children found in the orphanage share the same form. If the implication holds that the choir had been using surrogate mothers to produce these beings in volume, then the name of the institution takes on a different meaning entirely. It had started as a place that took in orphan children and used them. It ended as a place that manufactured orphans of a different kind. Celestial things that never had a parent in any meaningful sense, produced in numbers and left to drift through gardens full of flowers that no longer served any purpose. The choir's collapse did not stay contained within the orphanage. They had been, by the time of the night of the hunt, the ruling body of the healing church. The city's disintegration, the absence of any coordinated authority, the hunters scattered and purposeless, the church's administration simply gone, was at least partly a consequence of the orphanage consuming itself. The plumes of black smoke rising from its chimneys were visible from Cathedral Ward below, long before the night reached its worst point. Something had already gone wrong before the blood moon. Whatever order the choir had maintained over Yharnam was burned away along with the remains of their research. Their legacy persisted in a handful of places. The impostor in Yasofka's clinic carried it forward in the most literal sense, ascending even as the institution that had produced her ceased to exist. And Ebrietta's remained in the altar of despair, still looking upward, still waiting for a sign from the kin that had left her behind. While the choir aimed for communion through meticulous study and incremental change, the school of Mensis adopted a more direct strategy. Under the guidance of Mikolash, who had been a contemporary of Laurence at Bergenworth, the school held that humanity could violently shatter the veil separating human reality from the domain of the Great Ones. Their practices were extreme, even by the norms of a city that had come to accept blood ingestion and beast hunts as routine. The school of Mensis was based in Yahargul, the unseen village, a section of Yharnam that had grown increasingly cut off from the rest of the city. That the school operated from a hidden base is itself telling. Along with Laurence, the school of Mensis had contributed to founding the healing church, and thus gained a high seat within it. But as their methods grew more extreme, and their rivalry with the choir intensified, concealment became necessary. A faction with nothing to hide from its rivals has no need for an unseen village. The three affiliations became rivals, and conflicts sparked between them repeatedly. The choir sent agents to spy on the school of Mensis. The school responded by kidnapping members of the choir and the healing church. Evidence of this is found in Yharnam itself, where a dead choir member sits tied to a chair in a prison cell. There are no blood stains on his body, no burn marks, nor broken bones, suggesting he died from starvation or dehydration. A tiny tonitrus sits in a nearby chest, which some have taken as a sign that the interrogation was rather less gentle than the body suggests. The residents of Yharnam actively participated in the school's experiments, convinced they were the chosen few destined for something higher. The Mensis cage, a peculiar contraption of iron worn over the head by the school's academics, was purported to enable communication with the Great Ones by reorganizing the wearer's mind. It was described as a device that restrains the will of the self, allowing one to see the profane world for what it is, while also serving as an antenna that facilitates contact with the Great Ones of the dream. The fact that many who donned the cage never took it off, and in fact seemed unable to, was not a cause for concern within the school. Mikolash's fixation on the Great One known as Kos, or as some sources say Chasm, was the driving force behind the school's inquiries. He was certain that Kos possessed the secret to human evolution, and that a proper communion with this being would bestow upon humanity eyes on the inside, a metaphor for expanded perception that the school interpreted in a terrifyingly literal sense. The experiments to bring about this communion became progressively more radical. Subjects underwent procedures that sought to physically alter their brains, adding new organs or modifying existing ones to perceive dimensions beyond the three that ordinarily bound human experience. The Mensis Ritual, the school's crowning experiment, was designed to pull a Great One directly into the human realm, using a specially consecrated third umbilical cord, a relic of enormous power, whose origins the school kept secret. Their goal was to summon the moon itself, and the ritual demanded sacrifices on an extraordinary scale. The entire populace of Yharnam was to be the offering, their collective minds a beacon that no Great One could possibly overlook. Not all scholars agreed with Mikolash, and the handcuffs, many of them, were evidence of that disagreement. On the evening the ritual commenced, Yharnam seemed to vanish from ordinary sight. The district remained, but gaining entry became almost impossible. The few who succeeded found themselves in something close to a manifested nightmare. The inhabitants of Yharnam had been grotesquely fused into the architecture, their bodies melded with stone and mortar, while their minds remained conscious and trapped. The snatchers, hooded figures who had long abducted victims for the school's experiments, now roamed in the open, their work no longer needing the cover of darkness. Among those caught in the ritual was Edgar, a choir intelligencer who had infiltrated Mensis wearing their uniform as a disguise. The choir, fearing what secrets the school might be concealing, had sent him to spy on them. When the ritual completed and Yharnam was pulled into the nightmare, Edgar went with it. By the time a hunter encounters him there, has long since lost his grip on whatever purpose had originally brought him to Yharnam, his mind consumed by the nightmare's unrelenting weight. The ritual succeeded, though not in the manner Mikolash had envisioned. The school of Mensis did establish contact with the Great One, but the human mind proved wholly incapable of sustaining such a link while preserving any shred of sanity or physical integrity. The scholars were violently drawn into the nightmare, a plane where thought and reality bled together, and the laws governing the physical world yielded to forces far older. The school possessed only one umbilical cord, and it was not enough. The result was the stillbirth of their collective minds. Of the scholars present, only Mikolash survived with anything resembling coherent thought. What the ritual produced, dragged out of the nightmare and installed in a tower over Murgo's loft, was the brain of Mensis. It resembles a giant brain with elongated limbs, lined with unblinking eyes, and is one of the few known beings lined with eyes on the inside. Rotten and malignant in nature, it radiated frenzy into the surrounding area continuously, a weapon as much as a prize, and yet still something that crossed the threshold into what could only be described as a great one. There is a strange coda to all of this. A hunter who uses the make contact gesture before the brain, after it has been dropped helpless into a pit below, will receive a moon Karl rune in response. The rune states that great ones living in the nightmare are sympathetic in nature and often answer when called upon. Even stripped of its power, even broken, the brain still communicates. Whether that is mercy or simply the reflex of a thing that no longer knows what else to do is difficult to say. Mikolash attained his ambition of communing with a great one, but it cost him everything that had defined him as a person. His mind lingered in the nightmare, dispassionately pursuing the knowledge that had been his undoing. The nightmare of Mensis had become both his home and his prison, a realm shaped by his obsessions and governed by none of the rules that might have restrained him in the waking world. In the end, the school of Mensis got exactly what it reached for, yet that reaching was all that remained. The Fishing Hamlet was a community on the fringes of Yharnam's sphere of influence, a quaint coastal settlement where existence was dictated by the ocean's tides. The inhabitants led uncomplicated lives, their primary worries being the whims of the weather and the abundance of their haul. This all changed the day they found the carcass of Kos washed up on their shore, like some colossal, otherworldly thing pulled from the deep. The villagers, failing to grasp the nature of their discovery, treated the remains with reverence, viewing it as a divine offering from the sea. The proximity of Kos's body began to alter the hamlet in ways that were subtle at first, but deepened over time. The villagers started to have collective dreams of submerged cities and lightless seas. Their fishing nets brought up bizarre catches, fish with supernumerary eyes, and creatures that had no place in earthly waters. Some of the villagers developed an aquatic affinity that surpassed normal human capabilities, able to hold their breath for extraordinary durations, or navigate by ocean currents they could not rationally explain. The old blood had seeped into the hamlet, not through ingestion, but through mere proximity to a dead god. The villagers came to worship the corpse, forming a relationship with Kos and her parasites that, while strange, was in its own way sincere. When word reached Bargainworth of a great one's carcass lying on a coastal shore, it was treated as the most significant discovery the scholars had ever encountered. Gehrman and Maria were dispatched to investigate. What their exact directives were remains unclear, whether they were sent purely to study or with darker instructions already in hand. What is clear is that the Fishing Hamlet would become ground zero for something that neither of them could undo. Before the hamlet, there was Maria. Her story does not begin on that shore, but it ends there, in a way that nothing ever quite recovered from. Maria was distantly related to Queen Annalise of Cainhurst, a descendant of the Vileblood line. She grew up in that castle of cold formality and noble pretension. But unlike many of its inhabitants, she was drawn toward combat rather than court life. Female knights were not unheard of in Cainhurst, illustrated in the paintings that lined its halls, and Maria's natural talent marked her early. It would not be until she came under the tutelage of Gehrman, however, that her abilities reached their full measure. She was among the first hunters, trained in the period when the healing church was still in its infancy, and her Cainhurst origins would have needed to be carefully concealed once the executioners made their position on Vilebloods clear. Her weapon of choice said much about who she was trying to be. The rakuyo was a blade that fed not off blood, but demanded dexterity, skill, and patience. Maria was fond of this because she actively frowned upon blood weapons despite her heritage, while other Cainhurst hunters allowed their blood blades to define them. Maria chose to master combat through discipline alone. She carried power in her veins that she had no intention of using, and the rakuyo was the physical expression of that refusal. Her story at its core is one of restraint, of a person who spent her life holding something back. She arrived at the Fishing Hamlet as a hunter of the church, and she left it as something she could not name or forgive. The scholars who accompanied the expedition did not merely study Kos's remains. They carved into the dead god with saws and scalpels, drawing out blood and tissue, and discovered that Kos had been carrying a child. The orphan, as this unborn great one came to be known, was extracted from its mother's body for further examination. The villagers who attempted to halt this sacrilege were cut down without hesitation. And the slaughter did not stop there. The scholars deduced that the villagers themselves had been altered by their contact with Kos, their blood and cerebral fluid now carrying information about the Great Ones that was unobtainable anywhere else. The entire population was repurposed as experimental material. Skulls were pried open to harvest what lay inside, and the accursed bruise found in the hamlet today. Skulls worn smooth by innumerable scratches and indentations are the physical record of what was done to them. Gehrman and Maria led the hunter detachment that made this possible. They did not wield the scalpels, but they ensured no one escaped. Maria, who had always held to the ideal of clean and purposeful violence, found herself hunting down terrified villagers and delivering them back to the makeshift laboratory. At some point during the massacre, she threw her rakuyo into a well in the hamlet. She would not carry the weapon any further. If she was going to serve the church, she would do it without the blade that represented everything she had believed about herself. What the villagers called down upon their killers was not empty grief. The shaman's words, calling the curse of blood upon the hunters and their children's children forevermore, reflected something older and more binding than rage. The description of the defiled chalice confirms that curses are caused by inciting the anger of the Great Ones. And what happened in the Fishing Hamlet incited precisely that. Every hunter involved was marked. The hunter's nightmare, a pocket dimension of unending violence, closed around them. Blood-crazed hunters would be pulled into it, condemned to hunt without purpose or rest, their sins mirrored back at them in an endless cycle. It was punishment shaped exactly like the crime. Maria ended up in the nightmare, but not from blood madness. She went willingly, in a manner of speaking. After the hamlet, she took a position she believed could be restitution, becoming caretaker of the patients in the research hall. She tended to them with genuine care, a calm presence in a place designed to break people. The patients called out to her by name in their suffering, and she answered. But the research hall was not penance. It was more of the same horror dressed in different clothes, and eventually it broke something in her that the hamlet had only cracked. She sealed herself in the astral clock tower, and there she took her own life, using the rakuyo she had retrieved from the well at some point, the same blade she had thrown away in disgust. That she took it back was never fully explained, and perhaps did not need to be. Her death did not free her. The curse held her in the nightmare, bound to the clock tower as its guardian, preserving the secret of what had been done in the hamlet. She fought anyone who came close, not from blood hunger, but because she understood what lay beyond the door she was keeping. The search for knowledge had never been innocent, and she knew that better than anyone. When a hunter finally reaches her in the clock tower, she wakes from what appears to be death, takes hold of them for a moment, and then releases her grip. The fight that follows is not really between two hunters. It is Maria finishing a war with herself that had been ongoing since the Fishing Hamlet. Throughout the first phase, she fights the way she had trained herself to fight, on discipline alone, as if sheer mastery could keep her blood out of it. When it proved otherwise, she unleashed what ran through her veins. Her blood takes the rakuyo and sets it aflame, and what stands across from the hunter is no longer a church huntress or a reluctant Cainhurst descendant. It is simply Maria, with nothing left to hide behind. When she dies, the doll in the hunter's dream stirs. Her dialogue shifts, describing a sensation of liberation, of heavy shackles falling away from somewhere deep within. Maria and the doll share more than appearance, and whatever bond existed between them meant that the doll felt Maria's release at the moment it happened. Her spirit, trapped since the massacre, was finally laid to rest. The orphan of Kos, however, was not. Extracted from its mother, studied and discarded, it remained in a state between life and non-existence within the nightmare. A sound caught between an infant's cry and something ancient and furious. It used its own placenta as a weapon, fought with the ferocity of a creature robbed of everything before it had any chance at anything. And it sustained the curse that had pulled the hunters into the nightmare in the first place. Kos herself lay on the beach, a divine carcass that neither decayed nor disappeared. The nightmare held its shape around her remains. The villagers drifted through the hamlet in their ruined state, forever suspended in the moment of their betrayal. Their curse still active, their shaman's words still resonating through whatever plane the nightmare occupied. The knowledge extracted from the hamlet filtered into every subsequent discovery the healing church made. It was foundational, which meant it was inescapable. Everything built on top of it carried the same origins. The church buried the story as deeply as it could, and Maria had been one of the locks on that secret, until a hunter found their way to the clock tower, broke that lock forever, and gave Maria the rest she never had. The hunter's dream existed outside of ordinary space and time, a pocket reality brought into being by the moon presence, a nameless great one synonymous with the blood moon, and the pale blood that ran through certain hunters' veins. On its surface, the dream was peaceful, a refuge from the horrors of Yharnam, built around an idealized version of Gehrman's old workshop, its grounds quiet and its flowers pale in the moonlight. Beneath that surface, it was something else entirely. Gehrman was its first and most permanent occupant. The arrangement that placed him there traced back to Laurence, who had summoned the moon presence and struck some kind of bargain with it, presumably offering to bring it an infant great one in exchange for enlightenment. Gehrman was left in the dream as a form of insurance, a hostage held against Laurence's return. Laurence never came back. He had long since succumbed to the beast scourge and died, but Gehrman, sealed within the dream, had no way of knowing this. In his sleep, he called out to Laurence and to Willem, begging to be unshackled, his faith in his old friend entirely intact and entirely without answer. The dream accumulated hunters over the years, each gravestone on its grounds marking someone who had passed through and gone. hundreds of graves, many of them half swallowed by roots and foliage, evidence of how long Gehrman had been kept there, while the world outside continued without him. He guided each hunter who arrived, offered them counsel, and when their usefulness to the moon presence was spent, he ended their time in the dream with what mercy he could manage. He had done this so many times that by the time the hunt reached its final night, he had long since stopped counting. The doll, who tended to the hunters and channeled their gathered blood echoes into renewed strength, had been fashioned in the likeness of Lady Maria. An umbilical cord found in the workshop confirms that Gehrman had invited the moon presence in the first place, unable to cope with what had become of his most gifted student. The doll was his attempt to preserve something of her, an idealized and porcelain version of a person who had died carrying the weight of the Fishing Hamlet. Whatever inner life the doll possessed, whether granted by the moon presence or simply accumulated from the residual presence of so many hunters over so many years, she tended to those who came through the dream with a steadiness that Gehrman himself could no longer manage. The moon presence's purposes were not entirely clear, but certain patterns held. Like all great ones, it had lost a child, and like all great ones, it sought a surrogate. The dream, with its cycle of hunters being strengthened through combat and blood, appears to have been designed toward this end. Each hunter who passed through was drawn a little further from ordinary humanity and a little closer to something else. Most eventually succumbed to the scourge. A rare few did not, those with pale blood flowing through their veins, and these were the ones the moon presence watched most closely. Standing between the moon presence and the full realization of its designs was Rom, the vacuous spider, one of the stranger figures in Yharnam's history. Rom had begun as a scholar of Bergenworth, a research subject who had undergone Willem's process of lining the brain with eyes in order to elevate thought. The Garden of Eyes enemies found at Bergenworth appear to be the more common outcome of this procedure, their swollen heads driven to madness. Rom's outcome was vastly different. Through the use of Koss's umbilical cord, she ascended to something that could only be described as a great one, or kin to one. Her body vast and strange, and covered in cold blood flowers. Her face a mass of dull and sightless eyes. Mikolash's prayer makes the connection explicit, asking Koss to grant the school of Mensis what it had once granted to the vacuous Rom. Rom's mind, however, did not survive the process intact. The name vacuous was not incidental. Whatever she had become, she could no longer communicate in any meaningful way. She existed in the moonside lake, docile and still, surrounded by her offspring, and she served a single critical purpose. She concealed the blood moon. After the scourge first swept through Old Yharnam, and the healing church retreated behind the great bridge to Cathedral Ward, something had to be done to forestall total collapse. Rom was used to obscure the worst effects of the red moon, a veil drawn across the eldritch reality, pressing down on Yharnam from above. The citizens who remained went about their lives without seeing the amygdalas that clung to the city's spires, without feeling the full weight of what the blood moon would bring. Bergenworth was sealed and declared forbidden ground, and the scholar who kept its gate knew the password, because he understood what would happen should Rom ever fall. That cooperation between two institutions that had otherwise parted ways bitterly was itself a measure of how seriously the stakes were understood. The school of Mensis understood them too, which is precisely why they wanted Rom dead. She was keeping their ritual from completing. Her concealment of the blood moon a direct obstacle to everything Mikolash had been working toward. The note found after her death confirms it plainly. The ritual secret broken. Seek the nightmare newborn. When a hunter finally reached the moonside lake and cut Rom down, the veil dropped. The blood moon descended in full. Queen Yharnam's apparition materialized at the lake's edge, weeping before the descending crimson sky, while Murgo's cries echoed across the water. Everything Rom had been holding back arrived at once. The amygdalas became visible to everyone, not only to those whose insight had already been elevated. These vast arachnid forms had always clung to Yharnam's architecture, present and unperceived for years, and their sudden visibility drove many of those who saw them immediately to madness. The comfortable fiction that Yharnam belonged to its human inhabitants collapsed in a single night. The blood moon's descent marked the Mensis Ritual's completion, or rather its catastrophic partial success. The moon presence drew closer to the human plane, and its proximity accelerated the scourge dramatically. Those who had managed to hold the beast at bay for months or years found themselves overwhelmed. The clergy of the healing church, the same figures who had for years administered the blood ministration and preached salvation through old blood, transformed into cleric beasts en masse. Towering and monstrous, retaining just enough of their former minds to understand what they had become. The one reborn, hauled into existence by the reality-warping pressure of the Mensis Ritual, was the blood moon's most grotesque product. It was not a single creature, but a mass of bodies fused together, each component partially conscious, the whole thing existing in a state of continuous agony. It was a vision of what unchecked Great One influence ultimately produced. Not individual transformation, but collective absorption. Many people becoming one suffering thing, with no will of its own, and no purpose beyond existing as a vessel for forces it could not comprehend. Gehrman watched all of this from the dream, or felt it in whatever way a man imprisoned in a pocket dimension feels the world outside deteriorating. He had been there long enough to have watched Yharnam rise and begin to fall, long enough to have guided hundreds of hunters to their ends, and still Laurence had not returned. The moon presence kept Gehrman in his wheelchair, kept the dream turning, kept the graves accumulating in the white flowers outside the workshop. When the hunt's final night arrived, and a hunter finally crossed the field to face him, Gehrman did what he had always done. He offered mercy first, a clean death, and a return to the waking world with no memory of the dream. And when that was refused, he fought with everything the moon presence had left him. Not out of malice, and not entirely out of duty either. As much as he wanted to be done with the dream, as long as he had carried its weight, he could not bring himself to let another hunter inherit that same eternity. The agony was his. He had decided, somewhere across all those years and all those graves, that it would stay that way. Yet the hunter's dream was not a nightmare. That distinction mattered. The dream was peaceful on its surface, its workshop functional, its grounds quiet, its flowers pale and undisturbed. It was a cage, certainly, and a cruel one, but it was built to nurture and sustain. The nightmares were built for nothing of the sort. They were not refuges with dark undersides. They were places where the rules that governed ordinary existence had been discarded entirely, where thought and landscape bled into each other, and what a person had done in life shaped the terrain they were condemned to wander. The hunter's nightmare wore Yharnam's face, but wrongly. As already established, its origins lay in the curse called down by the survivors of the Fishing Hamlet, a prison shaped precisely like the sin that created it. The streets were recognizable in their layout and their architecture, yet everything was soaked in blood, the gutters running thick with it, the sky never shifting from its deep red. It was Yharnam, as it might look if the hunt had never been interrupted, if the violence had simply continued without pause or purpose, until the city itself became indistinguishable from an abattoir. The hunters trapped there were the ones who had surrendered entirely to that violence, blood drunk beyond recovery, condemned to hunt without rest or reason in a place that reflected exactly what they had become. Ludwig was the most prominent of them. He had been the first of the Healing Church's hunters, the founder of its workshop, a figure who had inspired ordinary Yharnamites to take up arms against the Scourge through sheer force of legend. He kept the holy moonlight sword wrapped and hidden, using it sparingly, allowing its reputation to grow into something larger than the blade itself. His hunters came after him in numbers, many of them clerics, and the church's hunting arm grew into a proper institution under his direction. Somewhere in all of that the blood took him. His body in the nightmare was a grotesque amalgamation of man and horse, enormous and feral, his face a ruin of stretched skin and clustered eyes. He had been down in the underground corpse pile for long enough that his endless killing had created a literal river of blood flowing through that part of the nightmare. The sword he had always carried was still with him, still wrapped, still waiting. When a hunter finally fought him and pushed him far enough, the holy moonlight sword revealed itself. The blade channeled the abyssal cosmos, and something in its light reached through the madness and found whatever remained of Ludwig inside the beast. he came back to himself long enough to fight the second half of the battle as the hunter he had always claimed to be, and to ask afterward whether his church hunters had kept to their valorous purpose. The question was asked by a severed head lying in a pool of blood. It was the most coherent thing the nightmare had produced. The nightmare frontier was a different kind of place. Where the hunter's nightmare was a reflection of human sin, the frontier felt older and less personal. A poisoned expanse of swampland and crumbling stone that seemed to exist simply because the boundary between the human world and something beyond it had worn thin there. Silver beasts prowled its toxic ground. Rocks fell from the sky with no apparent source. The nightmare of Mensis was visible in the distance from its higher points, and as touched on earlier when discussing the choir's understanding of stacked realities. From its cliffs, one could see the masts of ships that belonged to the fishing hamlet far below. The different nightmare planes pressed against each other, with only the illusion of distance between them. The frontier was believed to be rooted in ailing Lauren, the civilization that had fallen to the beast Scourge long before Yharnam. Its landscape, preserved in the nightmare as a record of that older catastrophe. The winter lanterns drifted through both the frontier and the nightmare of Mensis, and appeared again in the tunnels of the fishing hamlet. They wore torn and bloodied versions of the doll's garments, their hands identical to hers, their heads replaced entirely by a mass of eyes, mouths, and what appeared to be messengers fused together into something that had no business existing. They sang as they moved quietly, and the sound of it built frenzy in any mind that perceived them for too long. Their appearance near great ones was consistent enough to suggest some relationship between them and those beings, though what exactly had been done to produce them, and whether it had been done to them or simply happened, was not something the nightmares saw fit to explain. They were perhaps the clearest illustration of what the nightmare did to things that had once been human. Not bestial transformation, not cosmic ascension, but something in between that served no purpose and answered to nothing. The nightmare of Mensis held its own particular character, shaped almost entirely by the obsessions of the man at its center. As covered in an earlier chapter, Mikolash had gotten what he wanted, and what it had cost him was everything that had made him a person. He wandered its labyrinthine corridors in a state of fractured ecstasy, the Mensis cage still locked over his head, still muttering about eyes on the inside, and the cosmos and Kos. His school surrounded him in ruins, his scholars reduced to hollow remnants. The brain of Mensis chained in its tower above the whole catastrophe, radiating frenzy outward like heat from a fire. The nightmare of Mensis was what a mind looked like when it had made contact with something it was not built to contain. Every corridor, another fold of thought that had nowhere left to go. Every room, another chamber of an intellect that had expanded past the point of coherence and kept expanding anyway. Each of these nightmares pressed against the waking world in its own way. The barriers between them were not fixed. Things moved across fell through were pulled from one plane into another. The nightmares were not somewhere else. They were immediately adjacent, close enough that their weight could be felt in Yharnam on any given night, close enough that a single ritual or a single death could cause them to spill over entirely. What separated the city from its nightmares was never more than the thinnest of membranes, and by the time the blood moon had fully descended, even that was difficult to locate. The nightmares were the most visible evidence of what the Great Ones left behind when their attention passed through a place. But to understand what the nightmares were, it helped to understand what had made them, and that meant looking at the Great Ones themselves, not as objects of worship or targets of ritual, but as beings with their own purposes, however impossible those purposes were to fully read. They existed in multiple dimensions at once, their true shapes beyond what human senses could process. What humans could perceive of them, tentacles, eyes, impossible geometries, were merely the points at which they intersected with three-dimensional space. Everything else remained out of reach. Every Great One appeared to have suffered the loss of a child. This was perhaps the one thing about them that translated into something recognizably human, and even that translation was imperfect. The grief drove them toward surrogates, toward humans whose blood or circumstance had brought them close enough to the Great One's plane to be considered candidates. These arrangements never resolved cleanly. Human women who bore Great One children either did not survive the process or gave birth to things that existed uneasily in both worlds at once. The third umbilical cords preserved remnants of these births, carried enough of that essence to alter a human mind permanently. Odin, the formless Great One, had no body at all. He existed as voice and as blood, steering events in Yharnam without ever taking a shape that could be seen or confronted. Every drop of blood shed in the city potentially served his ends in some way, though what those ends were remained genuinely unclear. Ariana, whose Vileblood lineage made her a suitable vessel, gave birth to his child in Odin Chapel during the blood moon. The same celestial child whose form appeared throughout the orphanage in numbers that suggested the choir, had understood this connection and attempted to replicate it. The chapel dweller who sheltered survivors through the night of the hunt made his home in Odin's chapel, tending to those who arrived there with a kindness that sat oddly against everything else the city had become. The moon presence, whose role in the hunter's dream was covered at length earlier, appeared to be at odds with other Great Ones in ways that were never fully explained. Its practice of enlisting hunters implied it required human agents for tasks it could not, or would not perform itself. A note found in the lecture hall suggested it was actively seeking out other Great Ones, though whether to eliminate them or for some other purpose remained unclear. Its physical form, a ravaged thing of exposed ribs and long limbs descended from somewhere above the ordinary sky, suggested a being that had endured something, some conflict or loss on a scale that dwarfed anything in human history, though the details of it were lost to a time before Yharnam existed. Murgo's wet nurse guarded what remained of Murgo, an infant great one whose consciousness had been awakened by the school of Mensis, and whose cries had been sustaining the nightmare of Mensis ever since. The wet nurse had no discernible body beneath its robes, existing as animated cloth and blades arranged into a roughly humanoid shape, multiplying into several versions of itself during a fight, as though the concept of a single fixed form did not apply to it. It sang to its charge while it fought, lullabies that pressed on human minds with the weight of something ancient and indifferent. The nursery it kept was located in a nightmare rather than in any place that could be reached by ordinary means. And the child it protected may not have had a physical existence in any conventional sense. It was perhaps the strangest image the Great Ones produced, a guardian and a ward, care expressed in a register so far removed from the human version of the concept that the resemblance only made it more disturbing. The pattern that ran through all of these beings was not cruelty or hostile intent. That was the part that proved most difficult for the scholars of Yharnam to accept, because an enemy with purpose would have been easier to work with. Purpose had a shape and a direction. What the Great Ones offered instead was indifference so vast it produced the same results. They were drawn to human awareness, to the spark of perception that allowed people to dimly sense what lay beyond them. And every attempt to bridge that distance ended in ruin. Not because the Great Ones willed it, but because the gap between what they were and what humans were could not be crossed without something breaking. The healing church had spent generations trying to cross it through blood. The school of Mensis had tried to force it through ritual. The choir had tried to elevate themselves to a level where the crossing might be survivable. None of them had been wrong about the destination. They had simply underestimated what the journey cost. Every hunter who arrived in Yharnam came with a reason. Most had heard of the blood healing, the miraculous restorative properties that the healing church had been quietly advertising to the desperate and the dying across the world for years. They came sick or grieving or simply out of options, and Yharnam took them in and gave them what they had come for, and took considerably more in return. The hunter whose story runs through all of this arrived with something written on their intake form at Yesafka's clinic. A single word, Paleblood. It was not a symptom or a condition. It was a destination, a thing being sought, and whoever had written it down had known enough about Yharnam's deeper currents to believe that what they were looking for could be found there. What Paleblood actually was had never been settled. The theories accumulated over years of hunting and scholarship, without ever resolving into consensus. Some within the church believed it referred to a pure strain of the old blood, something closer to its original source before it had passed through generations of human and Thumerian veins and been diluted by that contact. Others pointed to the moon, to the particular quality of its light during certain phases, and argued that pale blood was not a substance at all, but a condition of the sky, something the city moved in and out of without ever quite grasping. A third interpretation, favored by those who had pushed their insight furthest, held that pale blood was the moon presence itself, or the blood it carried. The pale blood that ran through certain hunters and made them resistant to the scourge in ways that ordinary Yharnamites were not. The doll, after all, was filled with it. Every time a hunter came to her and grew stronger, they were taking something of it into themselves, being shaped by it in increments they could not feel until the shaping was already done. What all of these theories shared was the understanding that pale blood, whatever it was, sat at the center of everything. The hunt, the dream, the great ones circling Yharnam's history from its earliest foundations, all of it pointed toward the same convergence. The hunter who arrived seeking it would find, as the night wore on, and the blood moon rose, and the barriers between planes thinned to nothing, that the search had never really been about finding a substance. It had been about becoming something that could survive the finding. Whether that hunter had known this when they signed the form at Yesofka's clinic was another question entirely. Most likely, they had not. Most likely, they had arrived with a fragment of information, a name passed along through channels they could not fully trace, and had trusted that the name would lead somewhere. It did. It led through every layer of Yharnam's history, through the labyrinths and the nightmares, and the blood-soaked streets, and the orphanage's smoking chimneys, all the way to the hunter's dream and the thing that waited beyond it. Pale blood was not the beginning of the story. It was the thread that, once pulled, unraveled everything else. Byrgenwerth produced some of the sharpest minds Yharnam had ever seen. And what became of those minds is as good a summary of the city's history as anything else. Each of them followed their own particular line of inquiry to its end, and each end was shaped precisely by the nature of what they had been chasing. Willem outlasted all of them. By the time a hunter reached Byrgenwerth on the night of the hunt, he was still there in his chair on the lunarium balcony, overlooking the moonside lake, incapable of speech. A pale fungus had begun growing from the back of his head, quiet evidence of what his long pursuit of elevated thought had done to him over the years. He could only point toward the lake, gesturing at what lay beneath it. Rom had taken up residence there at some point, and whatever arrangement existed between them kept Willem anchored to that spot. He had sent 2 loyal servants to guard the roads leading to Byrgenwerth, and both had gone mad from their own exposure to the eldritch truth. Yet they had kept to their posts regardless. The college they guarded was long since empty. Only Willem remained, sitting with whatever he had managed to accumulate from a lifetime of inquiry, unable to share it and apparently unable to leave. He had warned Laurence to fear the old blood. He had said it plainly on the day Laurence left, and then repeated it quietly to himself once his student had gone. The adage was his, and it was sincere, and it changed nothing. Laurence took the blood to Yharnam and built his church around it. The church grew into the dominant institution of the city, and eventually the blood did to Laurence what Willem had always said it would. He became the first cleric beast in history, a transformation so significant and so damning that when hunters killed him, the church preserved his skull and placed it on an altar in the grand cathedral. Vicar Amelia was still praying to it on the night of the hunt, repeating the church's litany before succumbing to the same scourge herself. Laurence's skull described itself as a symbol of what he had failed to protect. His beast form was condemned to the hunter's nightmare, burning with a flame that never consumed him. Killed by fire when he first transformed, and burning still in the nightmare, as though the punishment had been made permanent. He was destined, according to the skull's description, to seek it out, but even finding, it could never restore his memories. When a hunter carried the skull into his presence in the nightmare cathedral, he rose and fought with everything the fire had left him. Between these two, the cautious scholar who stayed and the ambitious one who left, the entire history of Yharnam can be traced. Every institution that followed, the healing church, the choir, the school of Mensis, Cainhurst's vile bloodline, the hunter's dream itself, grew from the split between them. Willem's warning echoed through all of it, repeated in the adages and inscriptions of groups who honored it in name, while violating it in practice. Laurence's ambition shaped the city's bones, and on the night of the hunt, with Yharnam burning and the blood moon hanging over everything they had built, both of them were still there in their respective prisons, each one a monument to how far the inquiry had gone and what it had cost to go there. The hunt wore on, and the blood moon ascended ever higher, Yharnam's descent from a city into a charnel house. The streets, once thronged with pilgrims in search of healing, now flowed like rivers of blood. The city's sophisticated drainage systems, originally designed to manage the effluent from blood ministration, were overwhelmed, creating veritable pools of blood in the lower districts. The pervasive stench of iron and rot clung to everything, becoming so constant that the remaining citizens no longer even registered it. The populace, those who had not yet succumbed to the beast plague, succumbed to a different kind of insanity. The rule of the mob supplanted the authority of the church, as terrified groups of humans banded together to hunt down anyone they deemed to be infected. These vigilante groups were no less merciless than the beasts they professed to be fighting. They would set entire buildings ablaze, with families trapped inside, crucify suspected beasts in the public squares, and commemorate their violent acts with a religious-like passion. The line between human and beast grew indistinct when humans acted with such bestial savagery. The healing church's efforts to impose order completely disintegrated. The church giants, massive beings used as peacekeepers, turned dangerous when their handlers either broke or deserted them amid the chaos. They moved through the streets with their colossal weapons, another menace among many, their original purpose long since irrelevant. The kidnappers, who were agents of the school of Mensis, capitalized on the widespread chaos to procure subjects for their experiments. They stalked the streets with their large sacks, gathering up humans, transformed or not, for purposes that were only made clear upon witnessing the horrors of Yharnam. The bodies fused into the walls, still conscious and trapped, were the wretched fate of those they captured. The kidnappers made no distinction between human and beast, suggesting that this difference had become meaningless to their master's objectives. Central Yharnam, once the jewel of the city with its ornate architecture and majestic fountains, was now a labyrinth of overturned carriages, smoldering pyres, and hastily erected barricades. The citizens who still possessed enough sanity to fear the night cowered behind these makeshift defenses, but the barriers offered only a false sense of security. They served primarily to ensnare the citizens, cutting off their escape routes when the hunters or the beasts inevitably found them. The cathedral ward, which should have been a place of refuge, devolved into a killing field. The church servants, who had once graciously received pilgrims, now assaulted anyone who dared to approach, their minds broken by what they had been forced to witness. As Yharnam's night stretched into an eternity, and more hunters fell to the temptations of blood drunkenness or the beast plague, a different kind of hunters remained standing. These were not the formally instructed warriors from Gehrman's workshop, nor were they the church-sanctioned hunters of old. They were survivors who had taken up arms purely out of a need to endure. They fought not for honor or obligation, but for their lives. And this pragmatic approach made them both more brutally effective and more savage than their foreigners. Eileen, the crow, embodied a cold necessity in these final days. Hers was a tradition passed from hunter to hunter across generations, always to an outsider, always to someone beyond Yharnam's sphere of influence. The hunter of hunters existed to track down those who had gone blood drunk and grant them a clean death before the beast took hold completely. She moved through Yharnam like a specter, her crow-feathered attire a reference to the sky burial practices of her homeland, and she carried no illusions about what her work was. It bore no honor, as she put it herself. It was simply necessary. By the time the blood moon rose, she was already old, already pushing past what her body could reasonably sustain, and the final night asked too much of her. A hunter who found her on the steps of the grand cathedral found her badly wounded, her badge and her rune already set aside to be passed on. Jura, the retired hunter who had made his home in Old Yharnam, had chosen a different philosophy long before the final night arrived. One of the old hunters associated with the powder kegs, he had fought in Old Yharnam on the night it burned, and what he witnessed there had finished him as a hunter. He renounced his vows, retreated into the ruins, and took up residence in a tower overlooking the district he had once helped destroy. He came to believe that the beasts still held a spark of their former humanity and chose to become their protector rather than their persecutor. His formidable powder keg weaponry kept other hunters at a distance while he watched over them. His belief that the beasts were simply sick people rather than monsters challenged the very foundation of the hunt. Yet it offered no real solution to the ever-spreading plague. He had looked at the cycle honestly, understood where it led, and stepped out of it anyway. Alfred, the executioner, was driven by his own fanatical mission. His story already covered when discussing the Vilebloods and the executioners. His presence on the streets of Yharnam during the final night was a reminder of what the hunt produced in those who gave themselves to it entirely. A clear and burning sense of purpose that left no room for doubt or the possibility of being wrong. Pursued until there was nothing left of the person who had started it. These last hunters waged their wars in a Yharnam that was barely recognizable as a city. They navigated streets where the boundary between the waking world and the nightmares pressing against it had thinned to the point where the distinction required effort to maintain. In such an environment, the hunters were as much navigators of madness as they were warriors against beasts. The hunt had never been clean, and in these last hours, it made no pretense of being either. The armaments of Yharnam evolved in tandem with its hunters, growing ever more tailored to the specific horrors they were designed to combat. The trick weapons, which were marvels of engineering that could shift between different forms, were a fusion of practicality and symbolism. Each shift in form was a reflection of the hunt's inherent duality, the need for both meticulous precision and raw brutality, for elegance and savagery, for humanity and beasthood. The saw cleaver, arguably the most iconic weapon of the hunters, was the perfect embodiment of this duality. In its compact form, it was a savage cleaving tool, ideal for close quarters combat with beasts. When extended, it became a longer weapon, better suited for keeping a safe distance from dangerous adversaries. Its serrated edge, specifically crafted to rip through beast hide, inflicted wounds that would not mend properly, ensuring that even the regenerative capabilities of the beasts could not save them. The more unusual weapons were a clear indication of their creator's descent into madness. The whirligig saw, which was essentially a mechanical saw blade mounted on a pole, was a physical manifestation of the powder keg's philosophy that hunting should be efficient rather than elegant. The beast cutter, a weapon that could extend into a whip made of linked blades, suggested that its creator had come to understand that hunting necessitated becoming as savage as one's prey. These were statements about violence in Yharnam at its most elemental, as much as they were tools. Some weapons were even said to contain fragments of the cosmos itself. The Holy Moonlight Sword, Ludwig's legendary blade, could channel an otherworldly energy that was capable of slicing through reality itself. The weapon seemed to sing with an unearthly resonance, its blade composed of crystallized moonlight that should not exist in a physical form. Those who wielded it reported hearing guidance from the weapon itself, though whether this guidance came from the spirit of Ludwig, the moon presence, or something else entirely, was never known. The firearms of Yharnam evolved from simple pistols into weapons that could fire quicksilver bullets infused with the wielder's own blood. This blood bullet technique was the ultimate fusion of the hunter and their weapon. As the hunter literally became their own ammunition, their life force converted into deadly projectiles. This practice was incredibly risky, as it would weaken the hunter with every shot. But the blood bullets proved to be devastatingly effective against both beasts and the kin of the cosmos. The church pick, a weapon that combined a war pick with a sword, was specifically designed for hunting the kin, beings who had evolved beyond simple beasthood. Its thrusting attacks were capable of piercing the unusual hides and protective shells that the kin had developed, while its righteous nature, having been blessed by the church, made it particularly effective against unholy creatures. The weapon's existence was an acknowledgement that the hunt had evolved beyond simply slaying beasts, to confronting things that defied all classification. In the deepest recesses of the Healing Church's archives, a personal diary was later discovered, belonging to a blood minister, one of the clergy tasked with giving communion to the pilgrims. His entries, which start with fervent devotion and conclude in total madness, offer a singular inside look at Yharnam's fall. His initial writings are filled with the joy of healing the infirm, the honor of serving the church, and the glory of participating in humanity's next evolutionary step. His faith was unshakable, his commitment absolute. As the months wore on, the minister's journal entries began to betray a growing sense of unease. He wrote of patients who kept coming back for blood ministration, insisting they needed more to stay healthy. He started to observe physical alterations in the regular recipients: elongated limbs, oversized teeth, and an excess of body hair growing in strange patterns. When he voiced these concerns to his superiors, they reassured him that these were just normal variations, proof that the blood was functioning as it should. They even increased his own dosage of blood ministration to help him better appreciate the process. The minister's handwriting grew increasingly wild as the corruption took hold. He described dreams of sprinting through woodlands on all fours, the allure of raw meat surpassing that of cooked meals, and the way the moonlight made his skin crawl. He wrote of seeing a stranger's face in the mirror of viewing his own congregation as a potential meal, and of battling urges he could not put a name to. Yet even as his humanity was slipping away, he carried on with his duties, dispensing blood to pilgrims who had placed their complete trust in him. His last lucid entry details the night he fully broke. He wrote of the sensation of bones shattering and refusing, of his congregation's screams as he descended upon them, and of the sheer ecstasy of finally yielding to what he had been destined to become all along. The subsequent pages are filled with nothing but claw marks and blood splatters, though forensic examination would later show that they formed distinct patterns, perhaps a final attempt at communication from whatever fragment of a mind was left within the beast. The minister's testament laid bare the insidious nature of the blood plague. It was the most devout followers of the church, those who had administered and received the most blood, who were the first and most completely broken. That same devotion, which should have been their shield, became their undoing. To have faith in the church was to have faith in blood ministration, and to have faith in blood ministration was to guarantee an inevitable breaking. The most pious became the most terrible, their faith perverted into an insatiable hunger. Before its ultimate downfall, Yharnam had fostered an entire economy that revolved around blood. Blood rose to be more precious than gold, more coveted than any other resource. The healing church held a monopoly on the supply, thereby creating a system in which allegiance to the church was directly convertible into access to blood ministration. This economic framework fundamentally altered every facet of Yharnam's society, from its class structure to its foreign policy. The blood saints, who were the source of the diluted blood used in most administrations, held a peculiar place in this economy. They were at once venerated and exploited, their bodies quite literally treated as a commodity for public use. Some blood saints could demand exorbitant fees for private administrations, which in turn spawned a black market where the affluent could procure custom blood treatments. Others were confined to church-run facilities, their blood drawn on an industrial scale to satisfy the ever-increasing demand. The international trade in blood brought vast riches to Yharnam, but it also brought grave peril. Other nations would send their sick and dying to Yharnam, paying huge sums for the so-called miracle cure. But when these healed individuals went back to their homelands, they sometimes carried the beast plague with them. Several neighboring kingdoms had their own outbreaks, though none reached the severity of Yharnam's. The global community began to quarantine Yharnam, imposing economic sanctions that, ironically, only deepened the city's reliance on blood as its sole valuable export. Within Yharnam itself, blood debts emerged as a prevalent method of social control. Citizens who were unable to pay for blood administration could get it on credit, in exchange for owing the church their services or resources. These debts were hereditary, passing down to family members if the original debtor broke or died, thus creating generations of servitude to the church. Some families had been in the church's service for so long that they had forgotten the original debt they were repaying. The powder kegs, who were the manufacturers of weapons for the hunt, were one of the few economic sectors not under the direct thumb of the church. Their workshop churned out increasingly potent firearms and explosives, which they sold to both hunters and the church. As the beast plague grew more severe, their weapons became more valuable than blood to some of the populace. A dependable firearm could offer a kind of protection that no amount of blood ministration could ever guarantee. The collapse of the blood economy was a gradual process until it suddenly was not. As more and more citizens broke, there were fewer people left to harvest blood, maintain the city's infrastructure, or participate in commerce. The church began to issue blood vouchers, which were essentially promises of future ministration. But these quickly became worthless as the church itself crumbled. In the final days, blood was no longer a commodity to be bought or sold, but a resource to be taken by force. Hunters would harvest blood echoes from their fallen foes, and citizens would murder one another for a single blood vial. The economy of blood had devolved into an ecology of predation. Among Yharnam's tragedies was the destiny of its youth. Born into a city where blood ministration was deemed as vital as baptism, many were given their first dose before they could even stand. The church asserted that this early administration would guarantee robust growth and protection from diseases. In truth, it ensured that these children would never experience a life untainted by the influence of the old blood. Their growth was shaped by forces no parent could have named. The orphanage, presented as a benevolent home for children without families, was in reality the choir's main experimental lab. Here, children were put through procedures aimed at expanding their minds, at creating humans who could instinctively perceive and communicate with the great ones. The fortunate ones perished swiftly. The less fortunate partially succeeded. Their minds grew beyond their body's capacity to hold them. These children lived in unrelenting torment, perceiving multiple dimensions at once, without any ability to comprehend or shut out what they were seeing. Some children exhibited strange adaptations to the beast plague. Instead of changing into beasts, they acquired other talents, prescient dreams, the capacity to see things hidden from others, an innate grasp of the Great One's presence. The church would gather these gifted children, professing that they would be given a special education. What they got instead was vivisection. Their unique brains were dissected to understand how young minds adjusted to what no mind was built to hold. The girl with the music box, searching for her parents on the night of the hunt, was a symbol of the innocence that was obliterated by Yharnam's descent. Her father, Gascoigne, had turned into a beast. Her mother, Viola, had died in her attempt to find him, and the girl herself was almost certain to meet a tragic fate. Her music box, which which played a tune that had once pacified her father's rage, became an emblem of how the plague tore families apart, turning loved ones into monsters that no amount of affection could ever bring back. As Yharnam's rot deepened, even language itself began to shift. The old blood did more than just alter bodies and minds. It reshaped how people perceived and articulated reality. The Karl runes, unearthed by the runesmith of the same name, were the first methodical effort to render Great One communication into symbols that humans could process. These runes were imprints of meaning that circumvented conventional thought, searing understanding directly onto the mind, rather than mere script. Karl, who had been a disciple at Bergenworth, found that the Great Ones did not communicate through sound or sight, but through the direct conveyance of concepts and feelings. The whispers that resonated through the void between stars were pure, unadulterated meaning, impossible to translate into human speech. Karl's brilliance lay in his ability to craft symbols that could approximate these transmissions, although the act of translation ultimately cost him his sanity. Hunters who seared these symbols onto their minds acquired abilities that were a reflection of each rune's alien origin. The beast rune stirred the latent animalistic tendencies within humans, while the moon rune amplified the resonance between a hunter and their blood echoes. Each rune was a different facet of Great One knowledge, a sliver of forbidden truth that humans could barely grasp, yet could still harness. The blood echoes that hunters gathered held the memories, experiences, and knowledge of their original owners. To absorb these echoes was to assimilate not just power, but also fragments of other lives, other viewpoints. The distinction between self and other began to dissolve in the fluid medium of blood. The presence of the Great Ones even affected written language. Texts that were exposed to their influence would change over time. Words would reorder themselves. New sentences would materialize, while others would fade away. The Church's holy texts became dynamic documents, their interpretations shifting based on the reader's insight and how close one of the Great Ones happened to be. As conventional religion crumbled under the weight of what the blood had revealed, the people of Yharnam began to seek new entities to worship. The Great Ones, despite, or perhaps because of, their incomprehensible nature, became the deities for various new factions. This worship adopted forms that would have been deemed heretical before the plague. But in the current reality, they seemed to be the only sane response to an insane world. The Church of the Good Chalice rose from the ashes of the Healing Church, and its followers venerated the chalices that were used in Thumerian rituals. They were convinced that the proper use of these chalices could summon benevolent Great Ones, entities that would cure the plague rather than propagate it. Their rituals consisted of filling the chalices with different concoctions of blood, in a quest to find the perfect blend that would beckon a divine intervention. The fact that their rituals sometimes did succeed, but summoned things that were decidedly not benevolent, did not shake their faith. Ebrietta's acquired her own devoted following within the choir, comprised of scholars who believed she was the only great one who genuinely cared for humanity's fate. They saw her decision to stay behind when the other great ones ascended as an act of self-sacrifice, a choice to remain with humanity out of a sense of compassion. These cultists would bring her offerings of blood and knowledge, and in return, they would receive incomprehensible wisdom. They failed to entertain the possibility that Ebrietta's might have been left behind for a good reason, that even the other great ones found her presence to be troubling. The moon presence, despite its role in perpetuating the hunt, had its own set of devotees who viewed it as humanity's clandestine guardian. They believed that the hunt was a means to strengthen humanity rather than a torment, that the moon presence was training humanity to defend itself against threats even it could not name. These believers would willingly enter the hunter's dream, viewing their servitude as a form of worship. They never stopped to question why a protector would demand such a bloody and unwavering devotion. Some began to worship the beasts themselves, seeing the breaking as a revelation of humanity's true primal nature rather than a corruption. The beast-possessed soul found in the deepest chalice dungeons may have been an early follower of this philosophy. These beast worshippers actively sought out the change, performing rituals specifically designed to hasten their evolution into beasts. They were convinced that the human mind was a cage, and that beasthood offered a release from the heavy burden of rational thought. The most troubling cult of all was the one that worshipped the concept of the hunt itself. They saw the cycle of violence as a divine command, the deathless night as a paradise, and the blood moon as their one true sun. These fanatics hunted from a place of religious ecstasy rather than any sense of necessity, believing that each kill brought them a step closer to what lay beyond the veil. They would adorn their weapons with religious icons, say prayers before each hunt, and treat their blood vials as a form of holy communion. Their faith had remade the hunt from a tragedy into a sacrament. And so it is that Yharnam remains, trapped in its cursed night, a city that yearned for transcendence, but found only ruin. The old blood, the miraculous elixir that held the promise of curing all diseases, had indeed altered human suffering, not by eliminating it, but by magnifying it beyond all measure. Every single drop of blood that was spilled on Yharnam's streets carried the echoes of this original transgression. The moment when humanity chose to drink deeply from a well of power that it could never hope to comprehend. The hunters carry on with their dark work, though most have long forgotten why they started or what they aim to achieve. Each night ushers in new horrors, new breakings, and new revelations that the human mind was never meant to grasp. The hunt has become its own justification, violence its own rationale. Those who venture into Yharnam in search of pale blood, of truth, of a way out, find only a choice between different forms of damnation: to become a beast, to become kin, or to become nothing at all. The Great Ones observe from their dimensions that overlap with Yharnam's reality, their motives as inscrutable as their forms. Perhaps they feel a sense of pity for humanity's predicament. Perhaps they are the ones orchestrating it. Or perhaps they are simply watching in the same way that a human might watch insects struggling in water, feeling neither malice nor compassion, only a detached curiosity about how long the struggle will continue. Their influence is woven into everything, making it impossible to tell where human will ends and their manipulation begins. The Healing Church's grand experiment in human evolution was, in the most grotesque sense, a success. Humanity had indeed evolved, but into new expressions of suffering and horror, rather than the enlightened beings that Laurence had once dreamed of. Instead, Yharnam had become a fertile breeding ground for new forms of horror, new expressions of suffering, and new ways for the mind to experience its own unraveling. The city now stands as a monument to ambition unchecked by wisdom, faith corrupted by power, and the pursuit of knowledge without any regard for the consequences. Yet, there may be a strange kind of mercy in Yharnam's fate. The citizens who break into beasts are freed from the burden of thought, reverting to a state of pure instinct where complex suffering is no longer possible. Those who gain insight find that their human concerns are revealed to be meaningless, their individual suffering dissolving into the vastness of universal constants. Even the deathless night offers a kind of solace in the darkness, as one cannot see the full extent of the horror. The blood continues to course through Yharnam's streets, carrying with it the promise and the poison that defined the city's fall. Each drop holds the history of its collapse, the echo of every scream, every breaking, every moment of revelation and revulsion. The old blood remains what it has always been, neither a cure nor a curse, but simply change, a transformation without destination, an evolution that arrives nowhere. For those who still cling to the dream of escape, who still believe that the hunt might one day end, who still hope for the dawn to break over Yharnam's Gothic spires, perhaps the kindest truth is also the hardest one to accept. There is no escape, because there is nothing to escape from. This is what Yharnam has become, what it was always fated to become. From the moment the first drop of old blood touched human lips, the ending was sealed. The evolution achieved, the transcendence accomplished. Welcome to Yharnam, where the blood sets you free. Free from your humanity, free from your sanity, free from the heavy burden of hope. The hunt goes on, driven by its own momentum, for it is all that is left. The bells toll to remind any who can still hear that time itself has become meaningless in a city where the night never ends and the blood never stops flowing. This is the legacy of the old blood. Yharnam stands as an undying testament to humanity's greatest strength and its most fatal flaw: the inability to resist reaching for a power that was never meant for human hands. compulsion to drink deeply from cups that should have remained forever untouched. The old blood has fulfilled its promise perfectly, granting immortality through death that never ends, healing through wounds that never close, and salvation through damnation that never lifts. So close your eyes, dear listener, and let slumber carry you to dreams of fog-laden streets and Gothic towers, of blood and beasts and things that should not be. But be aware that somewhere in dimensions that brush against our own, Yharnam persists in its night without end. Its streets still resonate with the sounds of the hunt, and the old blood still flows, awaiting the next civilization, foolish enough to believe that they can master forces that existed long before the stars were born. Fear the old blood.